Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. And this is Coffee, and when we have a little bit of coffee with our wisdom and look at theological and philosophical questions from a humanist perspective. And for the past few weeks, we've been looking at the idea of inspiration. Now, why is that a theological question? Well, at one time, people thought that inspiration was from outside, the voices of gods often, and that's where a lot of our so-called sacred scripture comes from. So it really does matter where creativity arises from in terms of how we see the world and how we view texts, what has been written. So this week I want to talk about Sing, O Muse, and a little bit of a backup here. Remember that a couple of weeks ago I talked about mnemosiny. Mnemosiny, where we get the term mnemonic device, was the goddess of memory, and she was the mother of the nine muses. See how this makes psychological sense, that the mother of the muses would be memory, and that the various muses of various arts would be about memorizing things. So there is some psychological background to that. Last week, I was talking about the surrealists, and the first generation of surrealists attempted to access the unconscious as material for their art. They did that because Sigmund Freud had come along and had been talking about the unconscious as the source of many of our ideas and drives. Oddly enough, and interestingly enough, Freud and Salvador Dali, one of the surrealists, did meet. They had a mutual friend, and Salvador Dali really wanted to meet Freud. After Freud met Dali, he wrote this to that mutual friend. I really have reason to thank you for the introduction which brought me yesterday's visitors. For until then, I was inclined to look upon the surrealists, who have apparently chosen me as their patron saint, as absolute, let us say 95% like alcohol, cranks. That young Spaniard, however, with his candid and fanatical eyes and his undeniable technical mastery, has made me reconsider my opinion. So, yes, for most of the time that the surrealists had been around, there had been a very much of an arm's length idea here between the patron saint Freud and the actual surrealists. They didn't get along well at all. Well, now I want to look at some ideas about creativity and the neuroscience of creativity. There are lots of books out there about that. There are popular books, but there are also very serious scholarly works, such as the Cambridge Handbook of Neuroscience of Creativity. So, yes, more and more brain research is going on to discover what creativity means. It appears that much of it does occur in the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, but not all, as we shall see. Now, one thing that is very popular, especially among the more mainstream books about creativity, is the difference between the left and the right brain. Now, there is validity, scientific validity, to that idea of two halves of the brain, but it isn't as easy as one side is logical and the other is creative. Again, as we shall see. One of the leading neuroscientists into the investigation of creativity is Anna Abraham. She was the editor of the Neuroscience of Creativity, a collection of scholarly articles about this. She has this to say in an interview from the Scientific American. They did a whole issue on creativity and neuroscience. She says this in the interview. Most experts agree that two elements are central to creativity. First and foremost, it reflects our capacity to generate ideas that are original, unusual, or novel in some way. The second element is that these ideas also need to be satisfying, appropriate, or suited to the context in question. So, creativity, original, unusual, or novel, and satisfying, appropriate, or suited to the context. Now, the second one is an interesting proviso because for the surrealist painters, the context was just as out there as they could get. But if we're talking about real creativity and human creativity in all of its forms, we also have to look at the places where it can be applied for specific reasons. Dr. Anna Abraham goes on in the interview. One of the central challenges is to have a definition that can be satisfactorily applied across all manifestations of creativity, regardless of whether the object being judged is a work of art or a scientific theory or a public policy, and so on. All of these are creativity. She goes on. The creative mode is called for in contexts that are unclear, vague, and open-ended. The opposite is true of the uncreative mode, and so the uncreative mode involves walking firmly along the path of least resistance through the black and white zone of the expected, the obvious, the accurate, or the efficient, whereas the creative mode involves turning away from the path of least resistance and venturing into the briars, so to speak, in an effort to forge a new path. So notice how this works. In our day-to-day lives, we need actually a kind of flat ground to walk on where we don't really have to be all that creative all the time so that we can then access that creativity when we need to, and we won't be exhausted from all the thinking we've already been doing. She goes on, several large-scale brain networks that are known to operate in circumscribed ways in the uncreative mode are engaged in an integrative and dynamic manner during the creative mode. And this is new science, really, within the last decade or so, I would say, is that no, the creativity is not a little piece of the brain that suddenly starts glowing. Rather, it is the integration of several different parts of the brain. Examining creative thinking as a multifaceted construct has greatly improved our understanding of the roles of specific brain regions in specific aspects of creativity, such as insight, imagery, analogical reasoning, overcoming knowledge constraints, conceptual expansion, and so on. All these are different ways of being creative, and indeed, it appears they are triggered. They trigger different parts of the brain as they work together. Dr. Rex E. Jung, a professor of neurosurgery and a research scientist at the Mind Research Network and a practicing clinical neuropsychologist, goes on to say, creativity and intelligence are probably different types of reasoning. Both are very adaptive, but they're just different for different types of problems that you have to solve out in the world. So creativity and intelligence, probably two different things, think the neuroscientists at the time. And indeed, we have a map of a creative brain being creative and not this glowing one little spot in the brain, but rather all of these networks firing all over the brain to access all kinds of different emotions and ideas. That's how creativity appears to work in our brains. And you can see why ancient peoples thought they were hearing the gods speaking to them. Well, thanks a lot for listening today. On Thursday, I want to summarize these ideas about the muse and charisma and gifts from the gods and creativity. And how do we get in the way of creativity? Meaning, how do we develop a practice of being creative in our own lives? That's on Thursday. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you got questions or comments, be sure to email me, minister@firstunitarian.org, and I will see you on Thursday.